Welcome to our series of discussions for Fulcrum Intel Digest. My name is Itumeleng Sidiadia, and I work in the field of geopolitical and security analysis with a particular focus on regional conflict dynamics, intelligence assessment, and strategic competition between major powers. Much of my research looks at how regional conflicts intersect with broader systemic shifts in the international order, especially from the perspective of the global south. Today, we are discussing Operation Epic Fury, the joint military campaign launched by the United States and Israel against Iran. The operation reportedly began in late February 2026 and involved coordinated strikes targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure, ballistic missile facilities, naval installations, and command networks connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I am joined today by two of my colleagues from Fulcrum Analytics. I will allow them to introduce themselves and then we'll get right into the discussion. You can go ahead, Alvain.
Hi guys, my name is Alvin Swart. I'm the current director of Fulcrum Analytics. I specialize in human intelligence, open source intelligence. I'm also a hacker and I'm completing my degree in BCom law this year.
Thank you, Alvain.
My name is Cara. Thank you, Tumile. My name is Cara. My work focuses mainly on sub-Saharan Africa, but also on broader global issues. My specialty is collecting and analyzing terrorist propaganda from right-wing extremism all the way through to jihadism, with a focus on specific regional dynamics.
Okay, now let's get right into it. There are a lot of conversations that are being had with what's currently unfolding with this US-Israeli onslaught on Iran. But the most biggest of the conversations has to be around the power vacuum, as well as the regime shock, as we can call it. There have been reports and official statements from the White House and the US president stating that the intent of these operations was also to install regime change in Iran. And there's a lot of conversations around it because one of the most consequential developments emerging from this operation is actually the reported killing of Ali Khamenei, who has served as a central pillar of Iran's political system for more than 3 decades. So to understand the magnitude of this moment, I think we need to also appreciate how the Iranian state is actually structured. So since 1979, the Islamic Revolution that happened in 1979 was initiated by Ruhollah Khamenei. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Khamenei, yes. The Iranian political system has revolved around the institution of the supreme leader. So the supreme leader is not merely a symbolic authority, but he actually holds ultimate control over the military, the judiciary, intelligence services, and strategic direction at the state. And that's really important to note because of the demonstrations that have been happening in Iran now recently that led to the death of more than 6,000 individuals that were opposing the current regime, allegedly. So when a system is built around a single apex authority and it suddenly loses such a figure, intelligence analysts would often describe the phenomenon as what we would term a regime shock. And regime shock that actually typically produces 3 potential trajectories. The first is the institutional consolidation, where elite power structures quickly rally around a successor to preserve regime stability. Now, the discussions around what's happening in Iran right now are actually indicative of the fact that there isn't a single individual that we can say is the perfect person to emerge as the new supreme leader, because there's controversies around who is going to emerge as well. So the second possibility can also be elite fragmentation, where competing factions within that state, particularly security institutions, began to compete for influence, which is probably the most likely to happen. And the third outcome involves societal mobilization, where opposition movements can actually exploit the leadership vacuum to challenge the legitimacy of the regime itself. So I would say that in Iran's case, the most powerful institution capable of shaping this transition is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, commonly known as the IRGC. So the IRGC is not simply a military organization. It actually functions as a political and economic powerhouse, controlling large segments of Iran's infrastructure, construction, telecommunications, and energy sectors. So what would you say is the likelihood, Kara, that that would be the case and that we would see the IRGC taking a more prominent role in the leadership of Iran, given the current leadership vacuum that's happening?
Oh, what an interesting question, Itumeleng. I mean, in my opinion, we've seen them. We're seeing this very interesting phenomenon which we often term leadership decapitation, where you take out the ultimate leader of a group. We see this specifically in my field in counterterrorism. We've seen instances where, for example, the Caliph of Islamic State, let's say he has now been he's been murdered, he's been killed, he's been removed from his position. So, some analysts have actually noted that this doesn't actually really make a big difference um, if the supporting structures of command are still in place. And I think that's something that's very interesting here and notable that we should note here with the IRGC. What they've done actually during these operations, these military operations, is that they didn't only remove Khamenei, they removed everyone else who was also who are also pillars of this institution, by which I mean heads of intelligence, I mean heads of proxy forces, specifically such as Hezbollah and Hamas and other affiliates in this region. So, in my opinion, the IRGC, as far as I am aware, please correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, but as far as I'm aware, most of their leadership structure has been completely destroyed. So I don't see how they could come back from that. Although I'm interested in your opinion because I don't see how the IRGC can actually come back, like Itumeleng said, and almost rebuild what they lost. They've lost so much in terms of infrastructure, financing, leaders, people who individually inspired others than in their command to go out and to follow their orders. And as a military man yourself, I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on the taking out of not only the head, we're not only seeing it the decapitation. I want to say tactic in counterterrorism or in any field really. In this case, also we can use this term. So what would you say, Olma? Do you agree with my assessment, or what do you think?
Yes, thank you, Carl. Absolutely. So if you go and look at the four end states, or the aims as it's more commonly known, that was published by the White House as being their aim of Operation Epic Fury. The first one, as everybody knows, is nuclear prevention. They are trying to ensure that the Iranian government does not acquire any capabilities to build a nuclear bomb. That is their chief objective. Then it's missile neutralization as well, destroying Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. Now, that is purely for it being the delivery system of the possible nuclear warhead. Naval dismantlement. Everybody knows that the Iranian ship was also sunk in the last couple of days. However, the fourth end state that they mentioned is strategic degradation, crippling the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. So the IRGC is a strategic end state for the Americans. And if you look at the material that was published named targeting top terrorists from the Colombian states and international terrorism and warfare. In that material, they firstly state that the normal approach of every state when they're going after an enemy, or like we call an opposition force, is to eradicate the top leadership from the top to the bottom. However, the various analysts working on this paper did argue that it's no longer feasible as a strategic end only, because this leaders in these organizations are very charismatic. So they mobilize an individual to be interested in following their ideology or recruited into their organization by the charisma of the leader. And if you do take out the leadership, you still are left with the legacy and what they believe in. And then in such a case, self-radicalization is also a big thing because it's no longer necessary for a leader to radicalize or to motivate people to join their organization or their end state by physically going and recruiting them. If they can put out a message that is acceptable to some individuals, they will get individuals to, as active recruits, to follow them in their end state, in their organization. So I understand the tactic of going for the top leadership. However, I do not think that would really solve the problem because we do have succession in lower ranking members that will eventually turn out to be the next phase of the leadership. So that is my answer to your question. And you work extensively in extremism side of the intelligence sector. Maybe you have seen this in the past as well, where we go in as an armed force, we have the end state to take out a terrorist cell, and we do so very effectively, but only to leave a vacuum for that version of that terrorist cell to pop up again a few months down the road with new leaders, new capabilities, a fresh take on anything, and much more motivated than the previous cell that we took out.
Thank you
Oh,
for that,
absolutely. I
Alvin.
want to point out here, Itumeleng, if I can quickly jump in here and just say that this is something I've noticed monitoring chat rooms where they're like monitoring extremist chat rooms online, terrorist propaganda chat rooms. We see even what we like to call in the industry unofficial sources. Unofficial, by which I mean they're, for example, supportive of Islamic State, let's say, for example, but they're not the media that this unofficial source is producing is not sanctioned by Islamic State's main main news outlets, the Nashir and Amaq news agencies. And I've noticed, for example, these individuals speaking and saying, oh, this is not gonna. They themselves are saying, oh, this won't help. Um, in the end, lone wolf attacks are still going to continue. And this rhetoric was echoed in Al Qaeda supportive channels, which also said we must keep the fight going. We as individuals still have the power to make huge impacts, and in the name of this cause, in the support of Ali Khamenei, in support of the regime, in support of the ideology. Importantly, we notably see this in Itumeleng and Olvain, as you know, we see this always creeping up. With the advent of the internet and technology, it's so much easier in the modern day. It's a much bigger challenge, rather, let me say it that way, for counterterrorism operations to be effective. They are highly they are in a sense restricted almost, and it's much harder for them because it's not only about the on the ground operations. You have the cyber warfare side of it also that you need to tackle. And from what I've seen so far, there was an interesting piece that recently that came out. I'm trying to find the source, but I can't actually remember it. And they actually warned, and there's multiple other news sources have reposted this report where the U.S. It's from a U.S. Source, a very reliable source, that said that they are now heightening. There is now a heightened threat of lone wolf terrorist attacks in the U.S. targeting individuals that are the traditional enemies of the Iranians. Institution, for example, Jewish people, Christian people, anyone who doesn't fit the model of what the Iranian regime's ideology was, and they're actually motivating each other in these chat rooms to carry out these attacks. So you have that extra little bit of theater. This is an extra theater of operations, actually, that we need to be counting in addition to the ground operation. And I'm sure that Israel and the US and their allies are highly aware of this. But this is an interesting fact that we need to remember, and that's maybe very interesting to our listeners who might not be aware of this other front that exists outside of the physical realm.
So just to jump in there.
Yes, Alvain?
Sorry, just to jump in there, Cara. So three things. The first thing is when you have a threat or a new theater in your home ground, home country, you call it a real threat or real base of operations. Another thing is for most successful extremists, whether it be extremist or far-right extremist, must have two end states or two methods for them to be successful in their operations. The first one is initiative. So when we look at the self-radicalization going around on chat rooms, they have the initiative. They use their own capabilities, which they have to plan attacks, to do reconnaissance, to initiate new types of strategies. And because they are decentralized, they also have the freedom of movement. They can move around like they want to. Yes, the intelligence agencies does keep tabs on them, those cells that are known, but it's the unknown unknowns that keeps us up at night. And that's the unknown unknowns that every intelligence agency worldwide is working hard to try and discover. And because it's the unknown unknowns at the end of the day, which will slip through as an intelligence failure and a successful attack for extremism or extremists.
Okay, I feel like this brings us actually to the next speaking point that we had about this, because the second major regional implication actually concerns the vulnerability of Gulf states that actually host American military installations. We've got countries such as Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE that serve as logistical hubs for the US military operations in the region. So Iran's retaliatory strikes targeting US bases in these countries actually demonstrates Tehran's long-standing doctrine of asymmetric deterrence. So Iran understands, one could say that they understand that it cannot defeat the US in a conventional military confrontation. Instead, now what we see is that its strategy focuses on raising the strategic cost of American intervention by targeting regional allies and disrupting critical infrastructure. We've seen planes have been grounded now in Qatar and the UAE since the retaliatory attacks actually started from Iran. So, in practical terms, what we can see is that maybe this means that the Gulf states are now being drawn into the conflict, whether they wish to participate or not. So, even states that are willing to or attempting to maintain neutrality, such as Saudi Arabia, they're now finding themselves and their airspaces and maritime corridors becoming part of the battlefield as missiles and drones actually cross the region. So, what can be said is that this situation creates a profound security dilemma for the Gulf governments. Hosting US forces provides a deterrent against regional threats, but it can also make those states direct targets to any confrontation between Washington and Tehran. So, if the conflicts intensify, Gulf states may actually face increasing pressure to either distance themselves diplomatically from the US or deepen their security coordination with Washington, despite the risks that that entails. What are your sentiments on that, Kara?
Oh, I'm gonna throw this one to Olvain.
It's basically just about how, you know, the war has now become a regional war, and how the attacks now that are being coordinated against the neighboring countries are actually also influencing the regional stability there. Does Iran not have any allies in the region that it can maybe help them in their retaliatory strikes? Or what is this indicative of in the relationship between the Gulf states? Are they actually the lone country in the region?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing, Intermingling. I actually, Olga and I'm interested to hear your opinion more from the military perspective and the political side. But I've definitely seen Intermingling an interesting trend that's coming about, especially from if we look at the terrorism side, right? Because everyone, for context for our listeners, Iran is a known and proven supporter of jihadist terrorism across the world, mainly. They mainly supported Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, but these groups all have splinter groups that then operate separately. And an interesting thing that you made me think of now is how these groups will still, in my opinion, they are proxies of Iran. They're one form of them, although they might exist in other forms. This is one form of them, is extremist jihadist groups, and we see that they are so fragmented, these groups, that they can still, in my opinion, although they might not survive and be as effective in their operations as they were in the past before the military intervention from Israel and the US, they are still, and they've still said that we will remain, we will stay, we will remain. They've actually been inspired by this because, as Alva mentioned earlier, it can actually motivate people when there's a leadership decapitation within a group that you are associated with to actually mobilize even further. So, for example, we've seen statements from Hamas, from Hezbollah, saying Hezbollah, for example, pledged to fulfill their duty in, and I quote, confronting aggression. And they say they will continue to fight both Israel and the USA. So this is one example of a proxy terrorist force, jihadist extremist force, that is still operating and who has publicly said that they will continue. So this is one way that yes, they might not be based in the Gulf states. They, don't directly link to your question in what, more about the military side of the Gulf states and whether they're being dragged into it. But from a terrorist perspective, these proxies of Iran certainly still exist and will continue to remain. We know that they have support abroad, especially from, obviously it's abroad, but I mean from a further abroad, such as South Africa, for example, where we know here that Hamas has a presence. We know that they have actors here who funnel money from South Africa further abroad and directly to Hamas, directly to Hezbollah. The money goes into all of these proxies. So this, to me, from my perspective at least, paints this picture that these terrorist proxies are definitely one of the main ways that the ideology will continue to stay alive. It doesn't, and it won't necessarily end just because the regime has fallen in a sense. So yeah, that's what I would deem important from the terrorism side. And then maybe Olvain, what do you think? How does this interact with it? We know that Qatar funds terrorism. We know they are connected to Hamas. That's, for example, Hamas and numerous others. We definitely don't have time for me to go into detail about Qatar's terrorism funding, but this is one example of how a Gulf state is a proxy of Iran and how they will continue to act. What's your opinion, Olvain? Do you think it will continue?
Okay, so Cara, also, I just want to add there that we know Hamas has a strong presence in South Africa. We do also know that they are celebrated here.
Absolutely.
And we also do know they are not known to frown away from their presence. They are actively over in their presence. There's offices in Cape Town. It's marked. So they are completely safe to operate from here.
Absolutely.
And it's not only Hamas that's here. It's all the known, let me call them listed terrorism or extremism groups, and which is an enemy of the West. Who are based here, operating from here, gets funded here, gets training here, and sometimes they get some added security as well, also from affluent individuals.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely. For example, I would highlight to our audience who perhaps is unaware of this that Hamas's official representative in South Africa, Imad Saber, is also the group's international relations director for East, Central, and Southern Africa, which means that he has networks that reach many different theaters in Africa, and he can exploit all of those to call on funding and ideological support and to keep the group going, as well as Ibrahim Gabriel. So he's a famous Muslim cleric in South Africa here, and is the founder of numerous NGOs and organizations that are a front for sending money and financing to Hamas specifically.
And
so
we frequently write about it as well on our blog. And having an NGO as a front for whatever necessary means, it's a classic tactic. I always say to my students, although governments may change, tactics does not. And pertaining to the current status quo in the Middle East, number one, I will just say good job well done to the various defense forces like in AUE, actively defending against the missiles. It's a well done. It's really awesome. I think it also will be used as a case study going forward in various defense colleges for planning and defense. Other thing is, the proxy forces in that region, as well as Iran with the drone attacks, He's using a classic terrorist tactic because there are a smaller force attacked by a larger one to go to various choke points, attack their logistical lines, attack their logistical bases, and then have an effective propaganda machine enlarging that attack as successful or not successful, painting the US as a hegemony in the region. And that would also serve them down the line to control the narrative as well for them. The only question I think is who can go at it the longest. That would be a deciding factor in this campaign. I'm not so scared about China joining. I think because I know there's a lot of chatter on various intelligence
Yes.
networks and even in the printed media pertaining to bigger powers being at play. So I'm not too scared about China joining, and that's my personal view because I think President Xi is more focused on Taiwan and trying to to rejoin Taiwan with the mainland. He does not want to get bogged down in a war that he does not plan for. But it does not mean they will not send aid in forms of covert activity or equipment that we do not know of. And the same with Russia. I think President Putin is also more focused pertaining to the war in Ukraine and keeping his economy afloat than to get bogged down in Iran because the Russians also in the 1980s had the presence there and that it did not end so well for them. Since the time of Alexander the Great, any invaded army into the Middle East did not succeed so quite heavily that they would have thought. And another thing is that they did not leave the area in a better shape than they would have thought. So I'm not losing sleep pertaining to that. What I am losing sleep about, again, and I want to reiterate this, is the unknown unknowns pertaining to the extremist cells globally and what they are planning, and even nations like South Africa going out again and stating that they are announcing their renewed support to the Iranian regime. So we will have to wait and see what would be the reaction from voters pertaining to that.
Alvin, I think it's so great that you're actually also mentioning China because China is the biggest exporter of crude oil from Iran and one of their biggest supporters for the Iranian economy, given all the sanctions that they're currently facing. And the global economy is particularly sensitive to developments that are currently happening in the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most strategically important maritime corridors in the world. So apparently 25% of global oil prices or global oil passes through this narrow channel connecting the Persian Gulf to the international markets. And now we've heard that the ships have been redirected through the Cape of Good Hope route. That's another challenge now that's going to be facing our poorly infrastructure developed ports in South Africa. But that's a conversation for a whole other day. So when Iran signals that the Strait of Hormuz may be closed or disrupted, the implications are said to be immediate and far-reaching, specifically with energy markets reacting rapidly to geopolitical instability and even the perception of the disruption that can actually drive oil prices sharply upwards, which is another point in terms of how South Africa would be affected by what's currently happening in the Gulf states. So economists have already warned that oil prices could surge well above the $100 per barrel if the hostilities continue to intensify. And the consequences of such an energy shock extend far beyond the Middle East. We are going to feel it as well as far south as we are. And higher oil prices actually also translate into higher transportation costs, rising food prices, and inflation across global economies. And, historically, energy crises originating from the Middle East, particularly the oil shocks of the 1970s, have actually triggered economic recessions and political instability across various continents. So, in other words, a conflict that began in the Persian Gulf can ultimately destabilize governments thousands of kilometers away.
Absolutely.
What do you
Absolutely.
think this would be indicative of Alvain in terms of will there be a higher likelihood in terms of domestic politics in the affected countries to try and push for their government to take a harsher stance or to take some sort of a stance in terms of the Iranian and Israeli conflict that's currently happening? Are we going to see there be a higher likelihood? Because we've seen in South Africa, there have been demonstrations at the Iranian embassy of people showing support for Iran. But now, what do you think would be the domestic ramifications in not just South Africa, but in all the countries across the world in pushing for their governments maybe to take a stance or to push for some to have a more proactive role in the finding of a solution, because now this is going to be also affecting inflation, the cost of food,
Yes.
the cost of transport for just normal, ordinary citizens. So, how do you think this is going to materialize?
Okay, so two things. If I look at it from a strategic point, from the West points, I will see, or you will see that you mentioned all the oil frigates and all the supply ships has to or have to go around the Cape of Good Hope now. Now, if you look from a Western point of view, you will see that South Africa is not aligned towards Western values. It's more aligned toward the Iranian regime. So you can view it as an unfriendly port. And if hostilities escalates, you also can view it as an enemy. Now, I think at the end of the day, whether you are in South Africa or whether you are in another third world or first world country, your political spectrum is divided by, is the administration of the day supporting the West or Iran? You can also argue it to be, is the administration of the current day supporting the West or BRICS plus type of countries? And I'll see that opposition parties will use that as an argument or a statement to argue to try and maintain their voting base and also try and get new voters. So I think the divide in each country is now at the state where opposition parties will argue on the standpoint that the current administration is not supporting the West. It's going to affect negatively for us on the economical side, on a defense side, on a narrative side. There may be protest. And the opposing opposition may also use the same type of line, arguing against the West, against the attacks on Israel, against the negative impact that that may have on their economic. And the people in the street, especially third world countries or developing countries, where people, their daily fighting for survival, where the poorest is the poor, is getting harder and harder, and emotions will flare up, and you will have, you may have a more increased or elevated levels of protest due to the conflict there, because the prices of living is, and cost of living is going up, and politicians which are representing the people on the street supposedly have to give that people answers, and they have to show that they are hearing their plea and taking the matters up into Parliament.
I think that's such a great response
Absolutely.
about how domestic politics is actually going to be affected by what's happening right now in the Gulf. And whether countries want to admit it or not, there's going to be opposition also from opposition parties. So this is going to be a conversation that is ongoing amongst a lot of political parties in different governments across the world. So it's a really big one to watch, because it actually brings us into the next speaking point about the challenges to the rule-based international order. Because another major geopolitical implication concerns the legal and normative framework governing the use of military force.